Hi, thanks for coming to my talk about lesser prairie chicken response to translocation to southwestern Kansas and southeastern Colorado. This is some work that I completed with my master's thesis at Kansas State University. So just a little bit lesser prairie chicken background. Males display on leks for female selection. They're found in 4 distinct ecoregions, delineated mostly by vegetation composition. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed a listing rule for the species in May 2021, and the populations are declining most severely in the sand shinnery oak prairie and the sand sagebrush prairie ecoregions on the left side of that map there. Populations currently remain relatively more stable in the other 2 remaining ecoregions. So a large multi-agency collaborative translocation was proposed to boost the sand sagebrush prairie population. These roots were taken from the shortgrass prairie CRP ecoregion, where the largest portion of the population resides, and they were released on the Comanche and Cimarron national grasslands, where recent annual rainfall had thought to improve vegetation. Originally, there was 390 birds were set to be translocated from 2016 to 2019. In the end, a total of 411 were translocated, almost equally split between sexes and between release sites. 270 of these birds had very high frequency necklace style radio transmitters, and 115 of the birds had rump mounted satellite transmitters. So the objectives for my project, the first one was to estimate the demography of translocated lesser prairie chickens and determine short-term and long-term success of the translocation. This was done using lek counts in various models in program MARC. My second objective was to examine translocated lesser prairie chicken space use after dispersal. So this was done using 95% isopleth of kernel density estimators for the VHF birds and biased random bridge movement models for the satellite transmitter birds. I also wanted to estimate home range percent composition of different land cover types. And lastly, I wanted to evaluate resource selection at multiple scales for translocated lesser prairie chickens. So this was done using selection ratios of different land cover types from used locations, and that was generally thought of as a landscape scale, and using a Hoteling's t-test from the vegetation collected from used locations at a 300-meter local scale. So moving on to our lek counts here, as you can see, during our active translocation from 2017 to 2020, we had an increase of number of leks and active males on those leks. However, after active translocation in 2021, those numbers do seem to decline there quite a bit. For nest success, our overall nest success was 37%, and that was across all years, across all study areas. In Colorado, the nest success was 46%. In Kansas, the nest success was 31%. For land cover types, we had conservation reserve program, grassland, which again is agricultural grassland agricultural land that's been converted into grassland. We had 90 nests on that cover type with a 44% nest success rate. For private working grasslands, that's generally land that's grazed and has private ownership. There was 35 nests there at 14% nest success rate. For cropland, we had 9 nests and there was a 19% nest success rate. And in the U.S. Forest Service National Grasslands, we had 35 nests at a 29% nest success rate. Real quick with chick survival, we had 30 hens, so that's 14.4% of the total translocated hens produced 32 successful broods at 35 days post-hatch. Only 28.6% of nests that hatched had chicks that survived to 35 days, and the average brood size was about 3 chicks. For adult survival, we had 54 birds that had died within 2 weeks of the release, and 40 were not found after release, and so those birds were not used in the general analysis. For the breeding season, so from March 15th to September 15th, the overall survival is 44%. And then during the non-breeding season, which we delineated as September 16th to March 14th, we had an overall survival of 55%. For our home ranges, you can just see here the sheer size of our study area. This is actually after dispersal. We had many birds dispersing very, very far, up to 400 kilometers and circling back. But this is after that dispersal. And you can see in the blue, we have the satellite home ranges there, and in the red, the VHF home ranges that were estimated as well. So 343 home ranges were calculated, and there was a difference found between the transmitter types. That's kind of expected, as the satellite transmitters give us 8 to 10 locations a day. For the VHF transmitters, we have to go out and collect those locations, and so we average about 3 a week, and sometimes we can lose birds. It was just the sheer size of our study area and the amount of birds. It was sometimes hard to track those VHF birds. This has been shown in quite a few other studies as well, that these satellite transmitters, are going to produce larger home ranges. For home range composition, the land cover types within estimated home ranges did not vary among seasons. There was little difference in VHF home range composition between states and sexes, except that in general, VHF home ranges contain more CRP than satellite transmitted birds. So I thought that was very interesting here, and you can kind of see all 4 of our cover types there relatively being similar, except for the CRP. For the cover type selection for the breeding season and the non-breeding season, similar to home range percent cover, the selection changed little between seasons, selecting for CRP and avoiding for cropland, and the non-CRP private working grassland. So as you can see, they're very similar across the year. So what I found very interesting was for the cover type selection, specifically in Colorado. In Kansas, we did see males and females kind of selecting for similar cover types, but in Colorado, we see that females are selecting for CRP more than the US Forest Service land, whereas males are selecting for CRP, they're still selecting for it, but at less of a magnitude than that US Forest Service land. For our cover type selection for our nest, we see females are selecting for CRP and US Forest Service cover type to nest. At the local scale results at 300 meters or less, this less scale, there was a non-breeding season avoidance of percent bare ground. This is likely due to selection for thermal cover. They want to select for that grass and be able to be protected. And nest sites had taller and thicker vegetation for concealment than the random 300 meter locations 300 meters away. So for an overall summary, for my first objective, translocation was initially successful, but LEC numbers have declined, and current demographic rates may not be enough for the translocation to be a long-term success, especially with things like drought or severe rainfall or blizzards. For my second objective, home range area was similar throughout the year, indicating restricted resource availability, and home ranges were largely composed of CRP. In Colorado, males and females use cover types differently, which should be considered for any further management work. And lastly, translocated birds are selecting for CRP due to the taller and thicker vegetation found there. I want to thank everybody on this slide. This was, again, a huge project. It was a massive effort. We wouldn't have been able to do it with everybody on here, especially the private landowners of Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma. And with that, I just want to thank you for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions for me, you can use the comment section down below. Thank you.